Quit complaining and leave me alone.
I'm tired of you coming home late and yelling at me and the kids for no reason.
Oh, be quiet. I'm sick of you constantly nagging me for money.
That's because you stay out late drinking and wasting our money on booze and who knows what else.
I earn it, I'll spend it any way I want.
Not when you have children who need food and clothes.
That's it, I'll show you who's boss around here.
Don't you hit me again! Stop it!
No, Daddy, don't hurt Mommy.
Stop it! Stop it!
You've just heard the sounds inside a family's home in Louisiana. Imagine what that scene does to a young child's mind. It creates toxic stress, and it can last a lifetime. Toxic stress or adverse childhood experiences can impact a child through adulthood. Behavior problems, mental health disorders, substance abuse, addictions, even heart disease, cancer, and sometimes the cycle repeats itself with child abuse. This is the brain of a typical normal child who has lived toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences. This is the brain of a typical normal child who has not been exposed to toxic stress. The Cecil J. Picard Center for Child Development and Lifelong Learning led a collaborative statewide study on adverse childhood experiences. We'll now look how toxic stress can impact a child for a lifetime.
Toxic stress results from experiences that are severe, threatening to the person's health and well-being, long-lasting, and an experience that the child is not able to get out of, can't get away from. And in those situations, the child doesn't have somebody to turn to help buffer that experience or to protect him or her during the course of that experience. So we know that toxic stress has long-lasting impact on the child's health and development, and even the brain and the neurobiology of the developing child.
I think one of the reasons, in addition to adverse experiences, why we're paying so much attention to early childhood is because of how much we've learned about brain development and the process of brain development in early childhood.
A lot of the research that we know about toxic stress was generated in part by a study out of Kaiser Permanente and the CDC more than 20 years ago, where they looked at the experience of childhood adversity, and they included physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and what they called household dysfunction, parents whose parents were separated or divorced, household violence, a member of the household having mental illness, substance abuse, or incarcerated. And they found that adults who reported experiencing those during childhood had significantly more likelihood of having all kinds of chronic health outcomes as adults. And what they found also, importantly, was that the more of those experiences one had as a child, the more likely one was to have things like heart disease or cancer, substance abuse as an adult, depression, suicidal ideation, a whole host of health problems.
We're going to be looking at a graphic representation of two children, one who's grown up in conditions of severe deprivation, a very abnormal environment, and one who's grown up in a family and had typical experiences in the family. On the screen right now, what you're seeing is a graphic representation of brain electrical activity. So you see the little triangle at the top, that represents the nose. So we're looking from the top of the head down, and we're looking at a representation of brain electrical activity in which red and yellow represent more activity and blue and green represent less activity. And you see that there are two representations that you're looking at. On the left is a child who has grown up in conditions of deprivation and has relatively little brain activation. And on the right is a child who's grown up in a family and has typical patterns of brain activation. So you can see that just the sheer amount of electrical activity in the brain is reflected based on the experiences that that child has had in terms of being raised in a family or being raised in an institution in conditions of deprivation.
When these kinds of experiences begin to pile up, they begin to take a toll on the body and the developing brain. We know in Louisiana we have been forever ranked at the bottom of health measures, right? Our health outcomes have been bad. And even though there have been really wonderful opportunities and attempts to improve those outcomes, we've had a really hard time moving the needle to improve our outcomes significantly. And it turns out that many of the things that Louisiana ranks poorly on, like heart disease, like cancer, like obesity, like mental health problems, like poor pregnancy outcomes, are the kinds of things that can be affected by early experiences.
What we've learned is that the human brain is born anticipating getting certain kinds of information at certain periods that we call sensitive periods. And if that information comes before the sensitive period opens or after the sensitive period closes, it has much less effect. So it's critical that children get certain kinds of stimulation that they require at certain times, whether it's visual input to develop normal vision, or auditory input to develop language, or caregiving and nurturance to develop and form healthy, secure attachment relationships.
Now, it's important to know that not everybody who experiences these adversities or these traumas or toxic stress have bad outcomes. And so the question is, who gets those bad outcomes and who doesn't? How can we prevent those kinds of things from happening?
What we've learned about the effects of toxic stress in early childhood is that it can be long-lasting. That is, it can lead to changes, even changes at the cellular and molecular level, that predispose that child to long-term, not only mental health problems, but also physical health problems in adulthood. Now, that's not to say that that has to be the way it is. There are, in fact, ways that children can recover from early exposure to toxic stress. But the earlier that children get into adequate nurturing environments, the more likely they are to recover and the fuller their recoveries are likely to be.
A group of us from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, the Picard Center, the ACE Initiative, which is a group of child-serving organizations interested in enhancing ACE education, supporting ACE education, as well as researchers from the Tulane's Department of Psychiatry and LSU's Health Sciences Center Department of Psychiatry, conducted a statewide survey to find out what people were learning, how they thought about ACEs, how this information was transforming what they were doing and how they thought about the services that they offered.
I first got interested in the issue growing up. I didn't know what to call it or how to title it, but certainly toxic stress was a part of, my upbringing. Growing up poor, in a poor neighborhood with some crime and violence. Those things impacted me personally. As I got older and ultimately got into a career that involved interfacing with children and families, I'm a social worker, a licensed clinical social worker. I learned more and more about not only toxic stress, but the long-term and lasting implications. It really came home to me really when I became executive director of the Institute of Mental Hygiene. Our first annual meeting during my tenure, we had Dr. Vince Felitti, who was one of the architects of the ACE study, that is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And he really kind of had the research that indicated very clearly that early experiences, particularly those experiences with heavy stress and heavy anxiety, have long-lasting impacts that not only impacts mental health and behavioral health, but also physical health, that we can actually get somatic sort of injuries and challenges as a result of some of the experiences that we've had. So much so, and this is something that really resonates with me even today, is Dr. Felitti indicated that those with 6 or more experiences, real heavy, toxic, stressful experiences during their youth could have 20 years less life, so mortality, 20 years less, and lots of morbidity, lots of problems with health. And so it's an important issue. It's an important issue for me personally because of my upbringing, but also in my professional role, I have to interface with so many children and families and those who provide services to them that I have to emphasize how important it is to respond very early on to those situations where children experience toxic stress.
Unquestionably, brain functioning can be compromised when young children experience severe adversity. But it's important to remember that in early childhood, the brain has a substantial capacity for recovery. So this figure summarizes a study of brain functioning in 4 groups of 8-year-old children. As in the earlier figure, we're looking at a graphic representation of brain electrical activity assessed by EEG. Red and yellow represent more activity, and blue and green represent less activity. In the upper left, we see a group of children who had prolonged exposure to deprivation and have little brain activity. In the upper right, we see a group of children who spent their first 2 and 2.5 years in severe deprivation, followed by an intervention. They also have low levels of brain activity. In the lower right, we see a group of non-deprived children who show high levels of brain activity. And in the lower left, we see a group of children who experienced early deprivation, but then received intervention before their 2nd birthday. Their brain activity is high and indistinguishable from the non-deprived children. So what this figure illustrates is both the capacity for recovery in brain functioning that's possible, and also the urgency about getting children into adequate caregiving environments as soon as possible.
Prior to being on the City Council, I was a youth services librarian with our public library, and I experienced a lot of kids that would come into libraries after school, waiting for parents to take them home, and you notice some of their behavior. They act out, and when you calmly engage with them about behavior, proper behavior in the library, they get really, really over-emotional, irrational. A key phrase would tend to be, "I didn't do nothing." And to me, that's usually like the double negative is a stop and ask, like, "You okay? Are you hungry?" They kind of stop and they're like, "Yeah." A lot of times the irritability that they're expressing is that they just haven't eaten anything since probably 10 or 11 o'clock during the school day. That on top of being pinned up in a school all day and not having a way to expend extra energy, and now we're expecting them to come into a library and be quiet while they're really wanting to decompress. From there, I noticed that a lot of the kids that were coming into the inner city libraries would have the food from the backpack programs through the food bank, and those are, non-perishable items that kids would have that are self-sustainable so they can eat over the weekend so they don't go hungry. And I'm realizing the kids that have some of the higher levels of misbehaving are also the kids that are usually more impoverished and without those extra services wouldn't make it through the weekend. As a librarian, what I've learned about kids is that if they don't have the words to express themselves, they act out. A lot of times if you've got kids who are behind in reading, behind in math, especially in their reading, if they can't express themselves through words, they start to express themselves physically. A lot of times that over-emotional sort of build-up, it starts to exhibit as bullying. These are kids who are showing you what they're learning at home. They don't always feel safe, and a lot of that comes back to the toxic stress. They are triggered a lot easier, and they don't know what's going on because they don't have the capacity, and then they disrupt everything around them. And instead of being able to deal with that issue immediately with those kids and say, hey, let's de-escalate an issue, a lot of times there's so many other things going on that we immediately remove that kid from the situation, and we don't give them an opportunity to readapt, to recuperate.
It's really important that we look at families as a whole, because things that happen in communities, what happens with parents who are stressed, transmit that stress to their children. So it's really important that we look at the wraparound services for families to ensure that they have the best tools to nourish and make their children more resilient. And what we really look at in Louisiana is sort of two hands. We have the policy hand, where we have policies that keep schools from, for instance, expelling children who may be acting out as a response to stress. And then we also have the funding hand, where we fund those wraparound services, everything from making sure families have enough to eat, making sure they have a livable wage, making sure their communities are safe, and making sure that they have parent education. That's a funding piece and a policy piece that we haven't necessarily done very well in Louisiana, but when we do it well, you can see that children do not fall through our fingers because we put those pieces together. There's many things that we really need to focus on, and it's really a holistic approach. We need to help educate parents, and we need to train them to be parents, because I think a lot of people don't get parenting skills. There's no book. There's no science that we transmit to parents about this will help your children do better than this particular behavioral modification. And then we need those wraparound services. So when a parent presents themselves and needs food stamps, we need to make sure that they've got everything else that they need. How are your children doing? How is the stress of this going? Do you need to talk with someone? So we've really been looking at infant and early childhood mental health programs, like at the one at Tulane University, where the parent can call a helpline and talk to a counselor and have that person give them some tips on how to relate better with their children and how to better manage their stress. So it's really a whole wraparound that gives families the tools that they need to be more resilient. And these, we know, the science tells us that these adults become more resilient, become better parents, and become better productive adults.
I'm a child psychiatrist, and I've been seeing children for 11 years, and I work with children and families every day who come to me referred from education, legal, child welfare, a number of places, and a lot of them are affected by toxic stress. We see children who come to us and they have symptoms of toxic stress, which can look like inattention, problems with hyperactivity, impulsivity, and it can greatly impact their function at both school and home. And so sometimes these kids are said to have ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or they're said to be unproductive, lazy, and we know that here in Louisiana especially, we have a lot of kids who are exposed to stress, and that's because of adverse childhood experiences. That can be physical abuse, sexual abuse, the trauma of the different tragedies that we've had here, Hurricane Katrina being one, the BP oil spill being another, and those greatly impact families, and then it affects how children are treated and the things that they see. And so as you can imagine, even as adults, we can't really say how we feel sometimes, and so kids can become dysregulated meaning that their mood changes, they can be sad, they can be angry. This can lead to problems with production in school, failing grades, suspensions, expulsions from school. And so that's what I see when I see families that are exposed to toxic stress. Prenatal education would be critical because none of us are coming with a guidebook in terms of what we need to do, right? And so we have to start off early because the brain develops from the moment we get in there and we have all of those little neurons and all of those things making connections. And so we know that toxic stress can begin as that child is growing in the womb. And so we need to educate not only providers, family members, educators, general public, just what toxic stress looks like. We have to screen for domestic violence, issues related to housing insecurity, food insecurity, a number of things. And we have to start when those babies are young, when they're growing in the belly.
I first became interested in the topic of toxic stress, unbeknownst to me, as a 15 or 16-year-old. As I was working in an orphanage in New Orleans at the time, St. Vincent's Orphanage, with kids who did not have families. I didn't know what toxic stress was then. I didn't know what the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was. But that experience led me to, as a lawyer, work with children who were without homes. And all those kids in care, in foster care, in state's custody, were kids who had in their lives experienced toxic stress. So throughout my entire legal career, I've been focused on and thinking about the impact of stress, and now what I know to be toxic stress, on the lives of children and families. What I really want us to do is disabuse ourselves of the notion that little kids don't matter. and that what we teach little kids and what little kids experience don't matter. I've frequently heard judges say, it's okay guys, this kid's too young, he'll never remember this. That's the wrong analysis. You don't have to remember to experience stress. And stress, this is not a medical term, and my medical friends will probably not like me for it, but stress is like constant little nicks on the brain. And those nicks are like, you know, think about concussions. If you had a concussion every day as a kid, would you think well as an adult? And that's really the most sort of elementary way that I can put what happens to a child's brain when that child experiences input. We know well that children at a very young age, they can learn 2, 3 languages. Their brains are like sponges. Unfortunately, they're sponges for good and they're sponges for bad. And so when children experience early stress, that stress manifests itself in ways that informs their experiences and their abilities as adults. And it's important that we know that. Ever since I've been young, I've been thinking about why is it that we can't get a handle on the number of children that come into foster care? Why can't we reduce the number of children without families? Why can't we make a dent in this? And I think the reason we haven't made a dent of it is we have been downriver. And we need to get upriver. So the state needs a master plan to understand how to make sure that every child born into our state has early childhood experiences that are rich and safe. Because if you're not safe, you can't behave well. If you're not safe, you act out of fear, you act out of anxiety, and we see this in little kids. And those little kids grow up to be adults. So in order for the state to get ourselves off of all of the lists we don't want to be on, we need a master plan around adverse childhood experiences and its impact, and how to eliminate those experiences to the very best we can.
I've been a pediatrician now for over 38 years. First became concerned about the effects of adverse child experiences basically as a medical student, and carried that into my training and then into my practice as I became involved in a practice in Baton Rouge. The behaviors that I witnessed in children actually seemed to be very simple initially. Problems with sleep, problems with their actions in school, problems in their actions at home with their families. And then as that seemed to grow, the families would come in and would say, we're really having issues with little Bobby or little Sally behaving at school and their homework. We've also come to realize that the level of stress for the kids has become, we've termed it as toxic stress, where you're seeing that the stress on the children is so persistent and extreme that these children, not just as teenagers, not just in middle school, but even down to the child who is the first 3 years of life, the disruption in simple things, the predictability of feeding, the predictability of a safe environment. These things actually disrupt the child's cortisol level to the point that the child is under persistent stress from the physiologically. And the stress on that brain is what we now label as toxic stress, which actually disrupts brain development and adds to consequences for this own child's development.
I've been a physician and practicing with the Office of Public Health for about 20 years, and really almost since my first couple of years as a physician. First in residency in New Orleans, working with children in our pediatric clinics there, and then through our parish health units here in Louisiana, particularly in Acadiana, noticing that children and families who we routinely see over and over again for chronic physical conditions, mental health problems, oftentimes when we take a person personal social histories from those individuals, we found to learn that a lot of stressors at home. So individuals, families who were experiencing or witnessing violence in homes or in their communities, poverty, food insecurity. So, there was a pretty early realization that all of these outside factors actually impacted or were clearly impacting their individual's behavioral or mental health. It's not till just a couple years ago when we started to read or learn more about these adverse childhood experiences or traumatic experiences that people face, that they actually have a link or there's some interaction between those, or some link between those behaviors, those exposures, I should say, and individuals' physical health. So again, very clearly, early on, they affected mental health, behavioral health of individuals, but this physical health link is actually a new realization. So now we know that adults with even chronic medical conditions like hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, that there's a link between those physical conditions and toxic experiences or adverse experiences that they were exposed to as children. So for example, people living and exposed to frequent violence, domestic violence, shootings, natural disasters, hurricanes. We talk about mass casualties, even things that you witness on TV. A child, those are all stressors for children. Divorce, that can, again, interestingly, not only affect their mental health, but also their physical health. And so it's really important the adults who live and care for those children and their families and their school system and the court system, that they realize that when a child is acting out, that we may need to dig a little bit deeper and try to find the root causes of that behavior if we really want to change behavior and again, improve that child's trajectory.
For years, physical health and behavioral health have remained very separate when it comes to attention to diagnosis and treatment. And in medical school and in specialty training, the focus is primarily on that area of expertise in which you're going to practice. So physical health doctors who are internal medicine or going into surgery are much more focused on the diagnosis and interventions and treatment techniques for the diagnosis, and they're not as concerned necessarily about the whole person. Although in medical school you are taught to see patients as a whole person. However, with the practice of medicine, with every 15 or 20 minutes in which you are delegated to get a diagnosis and to prescribe a treatment intervention, there's not a lot of time to give attention to other factors that may be influencing the illness or the outcome of that illness.
I manage the child welfare system and deal with child abuse and neglect on a daily basis. So in Louisiana, at any given time, we have about 4,000 children who are in the foster care system. So on any given day, of the 4,000 children who are in the foster care system, virtually all have experienced abuse and neglect. That is why they're in the system. And many of them have experienced multiple forms of abuse and neglect. So the abuse and neglect that these children experience are often the result of toxic stress, the circumstances that their parents have experienced themselves as children often. So, no parent wakes up in the morning thinking, I can't wait to abuse my child today or neglect my child today. But when you think about the level of stress, the conditions that many of them are in, when you think about the histories that many of them have had and the experiences they've had, they often resort to the same practices that they were raised with. And many times those are abusive practices or neglectful practices. So many of our children have experienced multiple. Some have experienced, I would say, virtually all 10 of the experiences that are studied in the ACE survey. And it's no wonder that the children are experiencing the kinds of physical and emotional behavioral issues that they're experiencing. These children don't need just decent parenting, adequate parenting. They need better than adequate, better than decent parenting. They need above average parenting. And as the custodian of these children, the state is the custodian of these children, we have an obligation to make sure that these children receive the very best care to overcome some of these challenges that they've been faced with. Ensuring that we build a sense of resilience in these children is key to helping them overcome some of these factors that they've endured.
I've been working in juvenile justice for more than 20 years. We are in our main courtroom here, and this is the setting where we see children from 10 to 17 that are facing possible incarceration. The way that we can tell a child has that history, number one, you can look at their record and see a history of emotional reactions and trauma triggers that show you they have that history. We also can see it in the ways that, frankly, detention is less effective. Detention is, by definition, a negative reinforcement. With a child with a trauma history, that negative reinforcement is less effective because, frankly, detention is safer than the homes they're coming from. For that population that we work with that has suffered that kind of toxic stress, the future it's dismal without treatment. They will continue to have explosive responses, emergency responses in inappropriate settings that are going to get them in trouble with principals, teachers, law enforcement, judges, any authority figures for their foreseeable future unless they get treatment. The treatment options that we see for these children are, there's two specific kinds of counseling: trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDRs, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing. Those are two very specific kinds of treatment that work really well with trauma. If we can identify the children that have that toxic stress, that history, and we can get them those specific treatments, they work quite well. It's very, very difficult work. This percentage of children that are chronic kids, it's a very difficult population to reach. With that trauma treatment, we've seen some success. We've been able to turn around roughly 75% of those children. And so we're positive about that. I mean, that's a good result, but it is an ongoing battle. You have to stop the abuse in the home. You have to stop the stress, the toxic stress that they're taking in. You then have to get them treatment. And you have to give these kids, unfortunately, second and third chances. You're talking about essentially re-raising a child in a more appropriate way, and they need time to heal from all of those wounds.
I've been a juvenile judge for 25 years. I'm the chief judge of the Caddo Parish Juvenile Court. The adults that I was seeing, these young mothers who were involved in these child maltreatment cases, had very often themselves been subjected to or were survivors of serious child maltreatment themselves. And I really wanted to find out the extent of that, and so that I could understand the impact of maltreatment on those parents and what that meant in terms of providing care and permanency and a safe home for the children that we were seeing. And frankly, I just started asking the mothers and fathers, but very often mothers, at the very beginning of the case, literally the first time I had seen them in court in late 2016, we would have a bench conference or a hall conference or a sidebar conference, as it is sometimes called. We'd get the lawyers, the caseworker, CASAs may be involved, counselors occasionally, and the parents one by one, and we'd go out in this side hallway over here, and I would simply ask the mother, did anything happen to you as a child? And the responses of these young parents was startling. Frankly, it was shocking. There was an extremely high rate of very severe maltreatment of these parents. Very often relational maltreatment and very often sexual maltreatment, particularly with the young mothers, but also with young fathers. And another startling realization was how much domestic violence they had been exposed to, how many times their mother had been physically maltreated severely in front of them when these now parents were young children, when they were 6, 8, 10 years old, 5 years old, 4 years old, and frankly were not of an age where they could do anything. They were just, I think, from their perspective, powerless observers of this maltreatment of their own parent, and then many of them were powerless victims and ultimately survivors of the maltreatment that they had gone through. And I don't think any of us, I don't think the lawyers, I really don't think the caseworkers, and I know certainly myself, were not aware of the full extent, the pervasiveness of this very serious, often relational, often sexual trauma to these young parents. And at one point in this process, this went on for months, and I was asking and interviewing these parents, what happened to you as a child? I had one mother tell me, after she had explained some very severe treatment, this was the first time she had ever, with tears in her eyes, telling us, this was the first time she had ever told anyone about this experience. Very often, I would ask the mother or father, are you in counseling? Yes. How long have you been in counseling? 6 weeks, 6 months, 5 weeks. And I would say, does your counselor know what you have just told us about what happened to you as a child? And that mother would look at me and say, no. And I'd say, why not? And the mother might say, she hasn't asked, or he hasn't asked. Maybe they had asked. Maybe it was on a checkbox form. Maybe it was early in that relationship with their counselor where they had not developed the trust to be able to respond. But keep in mind, many of these parents I had only seen or known for 15 minutes at the time I'm asking this question about what had happened to you. And what we realized this, and again, 3.5 years ago or so, late 2016, early 2017, was that this system was not asking the right questions at the right time of the right people. And I realized that at a point in talking with one particular young mother who had an 8-year-old daughter in the courtroom just across the door, so to speak, at that time, that this mother was just that child 20 years later. And if we wanted to heal and wanted to protect the children and wanted to provide a safe environment for the children that we were working with, we needed to heal their parents. That's the best thing you can ever do for a child. Again, I've been doing this for over 25 years. I can't tell you how many times a teenage boy has looked at me when I've said, is there anything else I can do for you? Help my mother, help my father, heal my mother. They can take brain scans of soldiers coming back from the Middle East war experiences and compare those to brain scans, deep brain scans and neural maps of children who have been subjected to this early childhood trauma. Whoa, there's startling resemblance, similarities. And understanding that this stuff is real, it is serious, and it does impact our lives, and it becomes intergenerational if we don't do something to step in and provide healing. Over the last few years, roughly 0.1% of every foster child in the United States of America has walked through or been carried through the door of my courtroom, not this courthouse, my courtroom, one little judge in one little corner of one little state. About roughly 0.1% of the foster children in the United States of America have walked through the door of my courtroom. So if you want to understand why did I go ask these parents what was happening, that's why. I needed to understand that for myself, for them, and for the children that we are trying to care for, protect, and ultimately provide a safe, permanent home, ideally and hopefully with their family of origin, with their parents, where that can be safely done. our court experience was traumatizing for children, having to come and sit out there and wait for their cases to call. So we began to be much more aggressive about staggering our dockets, having a therapy, emotional support puppy there in the court. Some wonderful folks built a calming studio here at the court, a sensory room with wonderful play therapy, with wonderful activities, sands and projections of things, and what I call bubble lights on steroids. But these different sensory experiences and things that will make coming to court and maybe having to wait to testify if that's the case, or just wanting to be here at court, but not necessarily wanting or needing to be in the courtroom at the time, to be able to have a good experience with people who understand the special behavioral needs, the special emotional needs that children who have been through a lot of these really bad experiences may need.
I've been a district court judge for 11 years with exclusive juvenile jurisdiction, but I'm also a certified ACE trainer, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. The reason that I'm so interested in that is that children do things for a reason, and I kept thinking, why is this child repeatedly coming into this court when I say to them, if you do this, then this is going to happen? Then I started seeing the same children that were foster children, children that have had traumatic experiences. And so after years of going over this in my mind, seeing children, the pain in their face, then starting looking at truancy and following children's paths, you can see and follow, and there's a pattern. And they start off with truancy. Then they go into delinquency or behavior problems, and it really is a pattern. And so when Dr. Zena has the ECPLI training, it's with early childhood, and Dean Landrew, Madeline Landrew, who was also a judge, asked me to attend. When I sat through the Adverse Childhood Experience training, it all made sense to me. Adverse childhood experiences not only shape your brain architecture, but it translates to how you react to everything in your life. Once I went and sat through the ACE training, the Adverse Childhood Experience training, and I listened so intently, and I could not even believe that our brain architecture is not just about DNA. It's about the experiences that happen in our lives, positive or negative, and it impacts the biology. It impacts the architecture of our brain. It determines whether the frontal lobe develops or whether we act with a fight or flight response in the amygdala. It determines our behaviors, and it's that child in kindergarten where that teacher says, oh goodness, little Johnny is acting this way and I cannot teach the class, he must be removed. It was then when I would go to with the judges for our quarterly meetings with the secretaries of the state agencies, and we would look, and I saw that, oh my goodness, we're expelling 1,100 children in kindergarten. I started putting all this together and saying, 1,100 kindergarten children, they're not bad. What is going on? You ask a child, what are you doing? Why did you do that? These children have absolutely no idea why they are doing the things that they are doing. Why are they sexually acting out in kindergarten? Why are they trying to hit a teacher? Why are they throwing their desk or their pencils? Why are they trying to harm other children? Why are they still using the bathroom on themselves? And so it was not until I sat through one of those trainings and realized it's not why are you doing this, it's what happened to you or what is happening to you. And so after I started asking those questions, not only to children in my court, but to teenagers as well, it would take a 16-year-old boy, almost a man, and when you ask that question and you watch that child almost crumble and you say, "What happened to you? Where's your father?" And that child almost crawls in a fetal position because no one has even cared to ask, or no one has thought to ask. Because when you say, "Why did you do it?" they can't even formulate an answer because they don't know. They reacted with the fight or flight response because it's survival. And that's exactly what is going on. They are surviving. And they say these are inappropriate reactions. But it's not. It's absolutely appropriate for what this child has been conditioned to do. It's a conditioned response. This is what happened to this child. This is the only thing the child knows how to react to in order to survive or keep themselves safe.
The Louisiana Department of Health felt so strongly that information was needed by anyone who is working with families and anyone who is making policies for families, that the information about toxic stress and the importance of early experience was so important that it was something really that I wanted to support and for us to really to spread the word about. We is actually offering the ACE, the education around early experiences and toxic stress is something that emerged out of a work group between our agencies that work on early childhood policy, early care and education policy, as well as family coaching and support. It was at that time something that emerged out of other groups as well, and it was an opportunity for me to redirect resources into how do we create a common vocabulary around the importance of these early experiences and what their lifelong impact is.
I'm an adverse childhood experiences trainer, and I train people all over Louisiana. The people that I train are teachers, staff, and administration in K-12 schools, early childhood educators and Head Start programs, mental and behavioral health providers, pediatricians, medical students, people that work in the courts, mentors for adolescents and young adults. I teach them about the types of experiences that can contribute to and cause extreme and chronic stress, and how those experiences can influence patterns in our behavior, can influence what children need to be able to learn in school, and how those experiences can add up to create sort of a long-term inflammation of our stress response that can lead to chronic illness and mental and behavioral problems later in life.
I have been training people for the past 5 years about the importance of toxic stress in working with their children and within their own families, and identifying toxic stress in their own lives. And it's a critical part of brain development, child development. It impacts relationships. It really, simple things determine how you make choices based on what you've experienced in your own family. So toxic stress sets the brain on a path that is really critical. We have been able to identify that just looking at some of the children's behavior within the school system and within the families. So the goal is to help families identify how critical toxic stress is. Over the years, I have observed how in a parenting style, that aggressive yelling and screaming, we don't understand how yelling and screaming impacts brain development, causing toxic stress, which causes a behavior. So when I scream as a parent at my child, well, I love him dearly, but I'm frustrated and I'm upset, then I scream, I shout, I yell, and it impacts that child's brain development. And if you impact it over years and years and years, then you can see sometimes, it is, of my opinion, domestic violence. Children are not born violent. Children are not born with any particular behaviors, but the environment that we provide especially when it's a toxic environment, does more harm than we can even imagine. But now we have identified it, that of course we can talk to parents and give them strategies to help alleviate that stress.
Moving forward, and what I have begun to do, law enforcement needs to be trained, number one. If law enforcement is trained in the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, they have a better understanding when they go on a call. What are they walking into? How might this person be reacting? They're going to be reacting with a fight or flight reaction. They're not going to be logically with their frontal lobe making a logical decision. It's going to be a defensive or a fight or flight reaction. So I think it's imperative that we have our law enforcement trained. I think it's a safety issue for the people that the law enforcement are walking into, the suspects or the people committing crimes. I think it's also for the law enforcement themselves. It's protection. I think understanding and education is key. I also think it's imperative, after going through and becoming a certified ACE trainer, I went into the school system and started to train. I think in the Tangipahoa Parish School System, we have trained 220 of the teachers and administration so that they understand when a child reacts in a certain way, wait a second, maybe that child doesn't need to be expelled, maybe that child needs a timeout. Maybe something is going on in the home and they need to be questioned. Maybe they need to understand children better and the psyche of a child. So we need to also prepare teachers. We need to equip them so that they understand, why did that child just react that way? And make them understand maybe that child is not bad, but that child is reacting out of survival.
The goal of the training really is to encourage having a common understanding of what are the early experiences that matter, both positive and negative, and how they come into the fiber of our being. And so the goal of the training is really to have people have a common understanding of what the lifelong impact is of our early experiences, whether they are positive or they're negative, so that we can understand then how does that impact health, and then for us to try to create change within our own spheres of influence. If you look at if you look at reports around this and different activities that are happening in the state, you can see recommendations that are related to policy, you can see recommendations that are related to services, and really what is appealing and sort of the direction that I've chosen to take with supporting training like this is so that each of us has a sphere of influence where we can create change. And so I think what a training like this does is takes really hard, complex, entrenched issues and boils it down into a common vocabulary and a common understanding so that each of us can then, in our sphere of influence, make changes.
In conclusion, the question is, what have we learned from all of this? And I think one of the things that has been very impressive has been how knowledge about ACEs and adversity and its effect on children's health and development, the long-term health, has really spurred people to talk with each other in ways about what they're seeing that we've never seen before. It gives us a language to understand and to motivate us to make changes, and it's been quite impressive across the state how that's been happening. We know that we urgently need mental health and educational systems that are what I would call trauma informed. That is, they understand trauma, they recognize it, they have policies and procedures and approaches that help to mitigate the impact of trauma and may even help children and families to be more resilient in the face of trauma. We're going to have adversity occur, so we have to figure out how do we get through that, and our systems need to be helpful there. Our communities across the state, some of them are doing magnificent work. We need a way to communicate with each other about the great work that's being done. It's really been impressive how these communities are coming together across systems and trying to figure out what can we do to improve the outcomes for our children and families. And that gives and we also need parents to be involved. We need them to be informed, to be educated, and to really be advocates and partners in this whole effort to mitigate the impact of adversity on children. I think the state has a wonderful opportunity, and really we have an urgent need. Certainly in the case of COVID, we know that that may make things even worse for the people who are already experiencing various types of adversities. And we have momentum, we have creativity, we have commitment across the state. Now's the time to really pull ourselves together as a state to prioritize and to identify what we need to do to prevent and to mitigate the effects of adversity and toxic stress. And finally, I want us to remember that stable, safe, nurturing relationships and communities are both protective and they're healing. And we need to make sure that whatever we do, we are ensuring that children and our families have the opportunity to experience those types of relationships and those types of communities.
What will really help Louisiana the most is if we can understand the importance of early experiences, and by that I mean in the first 3 to 5 years of life, and recognize that children who've had adversity in those early years need our intensive and ongoing efforts to help them recover from that experience to the extent that that's possible. And that means everything from building up our workforce to provide interventions to children in that age range, as well as trying to create societal structures that are healthy and promote healthy development, such as childcare availability, etc.
The state needs a master plan for toxic stress, specifically for infant and early childhood mental health. There is a lot of issues that go into children's development, and the stress of families and the stress of just living can always be transmitted to children by their parents.
My recommendation to the state of Louisiana would be to focus more energy and more resources on early childhood. The most effective way to help these children with toxic stress is actually to prevent it.
We need parents to be able to interact with their kids in positive ways, to be able to de-escalate issues at home, to know more than one way to discipline a child, and preferably for it to not be a physical discipline.
I think one of the most important things is that we have policy that mandates trauma-informed systems of care. And by that I mean systems of care, that is those professionals and others who provide services to children and families, particularly children, understand the implications of toxic stress, and then they work with children and families. They don't re-traumatize children. Many children have been traumatized, which leads to that toxic stress. And oftentimes professionals aren't able to sort of intervene in a way that doesn't re-traumatize. And so we need policy that would mandate that everybody's trained in how to best intervene with children who's had these sorts of experiences.
Finally, we must remember that children and families need safe, stable, dependable, nurturing relationships and communities in order to respond to and deal with the possibility of adversity. And we must be doing all that we can to ensure that children and communities, in fact, are safe and stable and nurturing.